In the 1831 slave narrative, The History of Mary Prince, a West Indian slave, Prince tells her readers that one of her many masters before she gained her freedom had an ugly fashion of stripping himself quite naked and ordering me to wash him in a tub of water. She tells us that she sometimes disobeyed because, and I quote, her eyes were so full of shame. It was an action that earned her many a beating. This is an interesting vignette for a former slave to relate, turning the tables as it does on the typical representations of the day, as well as implying the sexual dread that she only hints at here. Prince's modesty is contrasted with the shameful behaviour of her master, content to be seen naked by a female slave and perhaps expecting sexual services from her. In images produced both by abolitionist and pro-slavery advocates, it was slaves who were generally depicted or partially clothed, while their owners and overseers usually sported full European dress regardless of the climate in which they lived. Thus, Prince's description of her naked master subtly questioned who exactly was beyond the bounds of civility and decency. While the naked or near-naked slave was an image that at once evoked African origins, field labour, and primitivism, that of an unclothed master invoked a very different spectacle, one which asserted Prince's moral superiority over a man degraded and tainted by his participation in the system of slavery. Among the many associations of nakedness, then, one common link, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, was with slavery. Though by no means a universal sign of enslavement, nakedness was a powerful and an immediate way to convey it. Such images of slavery run the representational and visual gamut, ranging from the sensational and the pornographic to the moralizing and the tendentious, serving radically different purposes. Visual depictions of slavery were a key abolitionist weapon, and we find slave images not only in literature, but on jewellery, household items, and more. And this, the Wedgwood Medallion of 1787, is surely the most iconographic version, but many more similar kinds of images do exist. There's much more to be said about the curious melange of the commercial and the artistic in the goods available for purchase by the ardent abolitionist. But today, I want to concentrate largely on what we call high art and to explore what I see as the critical link between nakedness and slavery so cleverly inverted in Mary Prince's narrative. Both the condition of slavery and the condition of nakedness posed problems in the art world, albeit in radically different ways. Artists walked a fine line as to how gritty their representations could be, given the demographic of their viewers and their patrons. The unclothed body posed thorny moral and often theological issues, and of course, the sometimes tricky division between aesthetic and acceptable nudity and coarse, unacceptable nakedness. Happy to talk more about that, but that's kind of shorthand for Kenneth Clark's work for now. A number of scholars have noted that the nakedness of the slave was a signifier of powerlessness. Simon Gikandi calls the common practice among slave traders of stripping the captives a key precondition for enslavement, encapsulating the many things the slave lacked, not just clothing, but culture, community, independence, and of course, free will. Eve Trout Powell sees nakedness as definitional of slavery, and in a wonderfully pithy quotation from an essay that she wrote, she says, "A slave looked African and a slave was naked." And her assessment, I think, is helpful in reminding us that slavery is not confined to the Atlantic, but has a history which is broader both geographically and temporally. Her observation refers to the Sudan in the late 19th century, and as we'll see, the attention of artists was by no means limited to the Atlantic slave trade. That said, I'm going to start with that trade. Art and sculpture, the media with which I begin my discussion here, drew upon a variety of ideas in depicting and commenting upon slavery. The female slave was the most frequently depicted subject, a preference which speaks volumes, not only about slavery, but about broader categories of race and gender, as well as the close associations between unclothed bodies and sexualization. The horrors of slavery were frequently figured through the sexual coercion of women, a practice which left the door open for suggestive titillation. One of the most celebrated, there it is, good, it came up they're in order. One of the most celebrated of artistic slave images, the American Hiram Powers sculpture, The Greek Slave. And I give you this detail because you'll see why there are a number of versions of this. This was the first life-size sculpture of a naked woman publicly exhibited in the United States, where earlier showings of art nudes had provoked considerable outrage. Puritanism has a very long history in this country. One of the many interesting things about this sculpture is that it appeared, if you look at the date, while black slavery was still extant in the southern US, and indeed would be for another 2 decades, yet the piece makes no allusion to it beyond the common image of the chain. The work instead concerns itself, allegedly, with the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s, popularly understood as pitting the Christian Greeks against the Muslim Turks. Look carefully at the drapery. Oops, let's go back, there we go. Look carefully at the drapery, and let's see if I can show you one. Oh, all right, well, I'm not going to be able to. Anyway, if you look carefully at the drapery, what you will see is a Christian cross and a locket, the symbol of love, below the figure's manacled hand. Modelled on the Medici Venus at the Uffizi in Florence, its form was classically derived, but its narrative was pure Orientalism. The modest Christian slave, her modesty and purity connoted by, I'll go back so you can see it again, by her downcast gaze, as well as the pure white marble used to carve the figure, is enchained to an infidel Turk, a villain who commonly appeared in the period in pornographic novels as an insatiable deflowerer of white maidens. She is leaning on her clothes, a reminder perhaps to the viewer of her natural proclivities as a Christian being clothed. The work implies that she holds on to these vestiges of another life despite her predicament. Powers made 6 versions of the sculpture, hence my detail here, which was also mass-produced for domestic households, especially from the 1840s when the invention of Parian ware made miniature statuettes popular for interior design in ordinary homes. Powers' piece could be bought as a smaller figurine or an abbreviated bust. It was available in photographic, this one is a stereographic form, on textiles and more. The most commonly exhibited version is the 3rd of the 6 versions. The sculpture was back to the Great Exhibition, was among the most popular items on display at the Great Exhibition in London in 1851, where it occupied a rotating pedestal on a central nave at the exhibition. The poet, the English poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, addressed a sonnet to this hapless maiden, admiring what she called the work's passionless perfection. Poets in the US also penned admiring lines. Lydia Howard Sigourney's Powers' statue of the Greek slave addressed this Christian maiden, as she calls her, adoringly, and DeWitt Clinton Richmond declared, and I quote, that purity enthroned sat upon the statue's brow. Powers, the sculptor, and his agent, the artist Minor Kellogg, successfully preempted the possibility of moral protests by issuing accompanying texts on the morality and purity the piece enshrined. Critics and poets dutifully followed suit, as we've just seen, and crowds flocked to see the sculpture. It went on tour beginning in 1847 in 12 cities across the US and was as successful in Slavonia, as Punch called the slave states, as it was elsewhere. Joy Casson estimates that more than 100,000 viewed the work. In the middle years of the 19th century, she tells us, no American artwork was better known. Its celebrity status in the last century has not saved Powers from harsh historical judgment. One modern commentator labelled the piece a highly successful and duplicitous commercial proposition, and I'm not going to argue with that, I think that's right. Yet in the 1840s, it was hailed for its moral delicacy. The piece is a curiosity. Its success derived from Powers' capacity to domesticate nakedness in a framework of Christian morality. Even in Puritan-inflected 19th century America, it was an acceptable image. The whiteness of Powers' slave, I'm going to argue, is critical to understanding the rapturous reception of the work, as well as its symbolic importance. Other than the chain's very convenient concealment of the pudendum, the figure is fully naked. A similarly naked rendered statue of a naked African woman slave would have found, I'm going to argue, a far less enthusiastic reception in pre-Civil War America, where it could not but have intervened directly in the fractious debate over the continued existence of slavery. But it also would have been impossible to stake a claim for the purity, as Powers does for this, of a fully unclothed black female slave in that way, in the way that Powers is able to effect for his white Greek captive. By the 1840s, the deeply colonial insistence that the black woman was hypersexual, lacking in chastity and modesty, was widespread. Sexual propriety was one of the markers of civilization, and Power's viewers would easily have read the many signs in his sculpture that separated this image of an enslaved Christian woman, modest in her enforced nakedness, from the lascivious images of black women that were so commonplace. Joy Casson, again, neatly sums up the formula then that made the Greek slave so successful. And I quote, "Nudity combined with modesty, constraint, and Christian resignation." When the sculpture arrived in London in 1851 for display at the Crystal Palace, Punch magazine, long a foe of Atlantic slavery, mocked the piece in a cartoon by the redoubtable John Tenniel, one of their in-house artists and perhaps best known for his magnificent illustrations of the very first edition of Alice in Wonderland. It's an interesting contrast. I'll give you the contrast in a sec. Bare-breasted and rather less idealized, Tenniel's slave woman is black and shackled at the ankles. To drive home the point, the pedestal on which she stands, itself an ironic prop given the subject's status, is decorated with the instruments of coercion, whips and chains. The etched motto on the pedestal, "E pluribus unum," out of many one, found even today, and here it is on the American seal and on coins, rings hollow as we look upon this enchained figure, out of many one, and yet look at the figure. Tenniel's rendering would have had a profoundly different effect in the US, even amongst abolitionists who, while welcome its message, might have balked at its delivery. I think this is just too upfront to have been shown in America at the time of slavery. Where Power's lily-white victim could be distanced from too close an association with the slave system with which it coexisted, Tenniel's cartoon quite specifically targeted the American slave system, right? You can see from all the pieces on there. The title of the piece, in case you missed the symbolism on the drawing itself, made that quite clear. Its title was "The Virginian Slave, intended as a companion to Power's Greek Slave." The cartoon made clear what many viewers in America chose not to see, the link to black slavery, and what Powers only made explicit, his growing anti-abolitionist sentiment at a rather later date. Punch's scorching critique notwithstanding, a sometimes self-congratulatory tone inflected British discussions of Atlantic slavery after the Emancipation Act in Britain of 1833, which technically, but only technically, abolished slavery in the British Empire. Tenniel's critique, thus, was not unique. Just 2 years after the Power statue went on show in London, the British sculptor John Bell, who, just give you that comparison between Powers and Tenniel. It's quite striking, as you can see. So John Bell exhibited this sculpture, which we're not going to talk about, but it's just to show you what it was that he was exhibiting at the Great Exhibition in 1851. But 2 years after Powers, in 1853, Bell, cast a striking bronze figure reminiscent of Powers' sculpture, but with some important differences. And as you can see, this is his statue, which now is on display in Scotland at one of the National Trust houses in Scotland. Bell deliberately modelled his figure after Powers, seeking on the one hand to capitalise on its popularity and indeed its profitability, but also as an explicit abolitionist statement. The title of Bell's sculpture, A Daughter of Eve, a scene on the shore of the Atlantic, followed Tenniel in locating his slaves squarely in the American South. Originally exhibited in plaster at the Royal Academy in 1853, he went on to cast his sculpture in bronze rather than marble, and I think that's quite significant. His slave is black, as it would be cast in bronze, and the fetters binding her are more realistic by far than those that confine Power's Greek slave. The piece changed names over the years. When Bell was working on it, he called it the Negress Slave. By the time it was first exhibited, the reference to Eve in the title trumpeted his abolitionist aim in its insistence on identifying a black woman with the biblical origin of womankind. Today, it's mostly known as the American slave, in a direct echo of the Power statue. Like its predecessor, it was a commercial success, much replicated and enjoying healthy sales in various forms and sizes. Again, things like Perry and Ware and so forth and so on. I'm going to put them up together so you can really see the striking difference between them. In creating the work, Bell departed from conventional and particularly from classical practice. His figure is recognizably raced, right, as you can see here. And while she is downcast like her Greek counterpart, the American slaves, the black American slaves' expression lacks the demure modesty of Power's creation. Her body is notably less soft and more angular, a sign perhaps of the manual labour that was her lot. These gestures toward realism would not have been welcome in a divided America in the 1850s, just as her nakedness and blackness could not have signified anything other than lasciviousness. Bell's use of the female body is by no means unproblematic, but its intent, I don't think, is to characterize the black woman as lascivious. Available, perhaps, even mildly erotic, but the intent here does not include a message of wantonness. Powers had produced a figure that spectators could separate from local conditions and whose whiteness defined her purity and her victimhood. Bell's representation came closer, although not too close, to the realities of American slavery, but in a sculpture that could not and did not reach that country. It's far from insignificant that these distinctions played out so vividly in the sculptural arena. More than other art forms, perhaps, sculpture held on to and enshrined classical ideals of beauty as refigured in the 18th century by Johann Winckelmann. The medium of marble was the pinnacle of that idealization, its whiteness connoting the purity of ideal, beautiful form. Resistance to sullying that association made tinted marble figures controversial, as John Gibson found out in the 1850s with his Tinted Venus. And Victorians resisted the notion, wrongly, that Hellenic sculpture was often gaily painted. Colour in sculpture, as Alison Smith has pointed out, was associated with vulgarity, inferiority, and even sexuality. Sculpture offered moral messages which spoke of purity and good and how beauty revealed these eternal truths. With beauty and whiteness so deeply intertwined, it was beyond the realms of possibility for blackness to signify pure beauty. It can signify sexuality, it can signify attractiveness, but beauty, another story. Bell, whose Daughter of Eve edged cautiously towards realism, pulled back from its implications when producing a companion piece, the Octoroon, some 15 years later. While the racial ambiguity inherent in Bell's statue sustained his critique of slavery by literally visibly demonstrating the absurdity of the racial categories that bound individuals to enslavement, the 1/8 black blood, right, the octoroon, the sculpture nonetheless traded in sentiments, I think, much closer to those of the Greek slave than Eve's daughter. Since an octoroon didn't look black, whatever that means, Bell could work in marble to connote the partial whiteness and Europeanness of this slave woman. And again, we get a nice contrast, I think, between these two. The result is a work far more openly erotic than his Eve, even as it promotes the modesty of its subject. Echoing Botticelli's Birth of Venus, it's remarkable, the similarity, as well as the well-known legend of Lady Godiva. This slave uses her hair for modesty, right? She's covering her body with her hair, which, while it's suggestively curly, has none of the so-called nappy quality which his earlier sculpture, Eve's Daughter, sports. The octoroon's body resembles that of the Greek slave, more than that of Bell's earlier slave figure, with its softer rounded waist and breasts. The chain which binds her blends in with her hair, almost as if it were made not of cold, hard metal, but of her own lustrous tresses. The figure, not surprisingly, proved popular with consumers. Stereographs, as well as ceramic and even bronze figurines, sold briskly, churned out by some of the best-known names in the business, with Minton marketing the ceramics and Coalbrookdale the bronzes. The octoroon hedged its bets, proclaiming an abhorrence of the institution of slavery, even as it claimed the naked female body as the rightful domain of the sculptor. What binds these and many other slave statues together is the portrayal of naked women, as much among European as well as American sculptors. And here we're just going to skip through a few examples for you. Here is Jean-Baptiste Joseph de Bay's 1835 sculpture, one of the few works in the 19th century that, like Bell's 1853 work, depicted a naked black female slave. This one has, of course, her genitals covered up, which is in a different way, in a much more obvious way, which draws, of course, your eye to the genitals. I mean, the first thing you see when you look at this is the apron, right? And that apron, I think, also has a kind of echo of some of the stuff about African women's labial genital aprons, which were considered to be these giant genitals that they were supposed to have. Of course, they don't. Representing the Italian tradition of slave sculptures, which I don't have time to discuss, alas, but will in the book, is Raphael Monti's 1851 sculpture with its trademark veiling. All of his stuff has these strange veils. And here is the work of his fellow Italian Giacomo Ginotti in 1877, just to give you some sense of this being it's not just an Anglo-American phenomenon, but much broader than that. All these representations share the exposure of naked female flesh, which was at once both a ubiquitous artistic concern and a moral issue. There were images of male slaves, I'm going to come to that in a second, and these were sometimes naked, but female slave bodies far outnumber those of men in 19th century sculpture. The abandonment of the slave system in the United States in the 1860s after the Civil War in no way diminished the appetite of artists or their audiences for this theme. In the American context, after all, there were commemorative statues to be made in the wake of the abandonment of slavery, and it's here that we mostly encounter depictions of black male slaves. At the close of the Civil War, the wonderfully named John Quincy Adams Ward celebrated the Emancipation Proclamation with his sculpture, The Freedman. Kirk Savage, art historian, speculates that when it was shown at the National Academy of Design exhibition in 1863, it may have been the first sculptural depiction of an African American ever to appear in an American exhibition. Ward uses a male slave to illustrate the arrival of freedom, a choice that should not surprise us in an age when women enjoyed few formal legal rights. This figure is classically proportioned and dignified, the chains that once bound him, of course, symbolically broken. Like the female figures discussed here, the slave is practically naked, a loincloth, frequently used symbol of the African slave, draped over his abdomen and thighs, yet there's no erotic undercurrent in this picture. Charmaine Nelson points out that while his face, and I quote, articulates a so-called full-blooded Negro physiognomy, but the perfection of his body is classical, that is, derived from the ideal, which by definition excluded the unnecessarily sexual. This was in itself a radical move at a time when artists and critics largely denied that the black body could fulfill or aspire to Hellenic-rooted ideals of beauty. Equally radical was the hint, visible in the man's attention to the environment around him, as well as the tree stump and the broken chains, that here was a fugitive, an escapee, actively rejecting the system which bound him and anticipating its imminent dissolution. It's an unusual piece for the time in its humanizing intentions, but its maleness is wholly predictable given the subject matter of freedom. Female slaves, by contrast, were almost invariably represented in bondage, bound by chains, their bodies open to the gaze of both the viewer and, by implication, an offstage owner or purchaser to whose desires they are already subject. The sexual fantasies at work here are by no means unique to sculpture or indeed art. Missionaries worried, as had Mary Prince, about the sexual degradation inherent in the system, and at the opposite end of the spectrum, 19th century pornographers made sexual enslavement a regular feature of their work. The nakedness of women generally, and slave women especially, not only titillated but signaled their helplessness and drove home their victimization. Women were all body, where the male slave could, on occasion, not many occasions, but on occasion, symbolize freedom and reason. Naked male slaves certainly could and did connote powerlessness, and I'll just remind you a different version of the famous Wedgwood image, the beseeching figure, complete with loincloth again. I mean, you see how common that is as a trope. But in the context of emancipation, male slaves might, if rarely, signify hope and a new beginning, as in the sculpture by John Quincy Adams Ward. The man's lack of clothing indicates both his prior enslavement and the possibility that the black body could conform to the ideal principles of physical perfection. Naked slave women could not fulfill that ideal and could not signify the promise of future freedom. They could be sensuous, they could be nubile, they could be arousing and even attractive, but the poetics of Hellenic Victorian beauty were not theirs to occupy. A similar logic to this was at work in Thomas Ball's near-contemporary statue, Emancipation. Like Ward, Ball aimed to celebrate the end of slavery and also to laud Lincoln's role in it. Like other such sculptures of the period, its framing suggests the limits both of white empathy and what the sculptural form, still tied to classicism, could achieve. Inevitably and unsurprisingly, what we notice first is that Lincoln is dressed and standing tall, while the black man, wearing nothing but the trademark loincloth, crouches in gratitude at his feet. The manacles at his wrist are broken, but if you actually spin the statue round, he remains shackled at the back of the statue, and I'm sorry I don't have that to show you. The dressed-undressed formula that's clear here, right? White dressed, black undressed, as well as the striking difference in posture, crouching and standing, makes Ball's work, I think, very uncomfortable to contemporary eyes, as well as historically inaccurate in terms of the role that Lincoln actually played in the abolition of slavery, with its glorification of the white man and the dismissive passivity of the former slave. Less dignified by virtue of his genuflection to a white saviour than Ward's dignified the freeman, the African figure in Emancipation, also sometimes called, and perhaps more aptly the Lincoln Memorial, reminds us of the sheer tenacity of nakedness as the foremost emblem of racialized powerlessness, whether the enslaved is male or female, whether the form hewed to classicism or not, and well beyond the confines of Atlantic slavery. It was a trope that long outlived the abandonment of that particular slave system. The last sculpture I want to discuss today takes us into the 20th century and away from the United States to another location. Herbert Ward, an English-born artist who spent 5 years in the Congo, Central Africa in the 1890s, produced a good number of sculptures with African subjects. Slavery in general was not a common theme in his work, but his friendship with the anti-slavery campaigner Edmund Dean Morel made him aware of the atrocities committed in the Congo during the rule of Belgium's King Leopold in the late 1890s and into the early 1900s. Morel was instrumental in ensuring the international controversy over conditions in the Central African colony and the stripping of that colony from King Leopold's personal possessions. Ward's 1903 statue, shown here, Les Fugitifs, or The Fugitives, obviously, in English, shares the theme in John Quincy Adams Ward's namesake's 1860 figure, the escape from slavery. He, very unusually, was a female figure, a desperate mother fleeing with her children. Different versions of the work include different numbers of children. Ward's sculpture, a version of which became the frontispiece for Morel's 1904 exposé King Leopold's rule in Africa, is distinctive, I think, for the way in which it connotes movement and urgency. One can feel her fear that the bounty hunters, the slave hunters, are getting closer. There's none of the passivity so common in earlier works that show slaves. And to accord this degree of agency to a slave woman was unusual. Yet, at the same time, the work also bears many of the characteristic features that haunted how women of colour and how slaves were portrayed. One child is here at the breast, an image that occurs time and time again in anthropological as well as artistic and semi-pornographic representations. All the figures are largely naked. More ethnographically specific than many such works, visible in the careful details of ornamentation, and certainly sympathetic to the fear and anxiety of the figures he presents, Ward's Fugitives nonetheless still echoes and replicates, I think, long-held colonial assumptions and beliefs about non-European peoples. The sculptures discussed here, for the most part, aimed to evoke both pathos and eroticism, even as some, as in the case of Powers, protested the purity of their vision and their intention, and many of the artists were genuinely appalled by the horrors of slavery. A similar ambiguity is common in other media. Far more than in sculpture, 18th and 19th century painting portrayed the woman slave seductively, where the materials as well as the principles governing sculpture tended, at least until the dawn of the 20th century, to promote heroic idealism as the proper subject of the medium. Artists working in other media were less restricted. Canvas, for example, allowed for greater detail and more figures and background, so painters could fill in details that sculptors could only imply. You don't see the slave owner in the sculpture, but you sure as hell do, as I'm about to show you, in the paintings. An entire genre of 19th century painting disguised titillation in a rhetoric of compassion and protest, and as in sculpture, it focused on the naked white woman enslaved by distinctly non-European men who were present, not merely implied, as the focal point. She is gazed upon by multiple observers, those attending the market where she is on offer, and those in the gallery where she is also on display, and perhaps for sale again there too. It was a trope taken up by storied artists of the time, as well as lesser names. Jean-Louis Gérôme's The Slave Market is surely the most famous of this ilk, and he himself made a number of similar paintings depicting white and occasionally black women slaves for sale. Like so much of his oeuvre, this painting leaves little to the imagination. It really is his trademark. We see a potential buyer, foreign in his exotic garb, with his hand in the mouth of a full-frontal naked white woman. I suspect that's also about penetration of other parts. Other men pressing in to witness this inspection. A small group of women, now shrouded in cloths, but clearly naked under them, or in makeshift, huddled to the side. It's the men who are elaborately dressed. The women are naked or in makeshift clothes, right, as you can see here on the left of the painting. Linda Notchlin, the art historian, has brilliantly skewered this school of art, channeling Gérôme, into whose long dead mouth she places this, I think, hilarious utterance, and this is a quote. "Don't think that I or any other right-thinking Frenchman would ever be involved in this sort of thing. I'm merely taking careful note of the fact that less enlightened races indulge in the trade in naked women. But isn't it arousing?" This was Notchlin. It's a wonderful, wonderful piece, I think. This distinctly Orientalist school, I'm just going to show you three examples, rather less famous examples than Gérôme. And I don't have dates for any of these pieces because I've been able to find them. So if anybody knows the dates on these pieces, I'm listening. So then these are by relatively unknown artists as well. So there's Devreux, you can see again, the white passive slave woman being kind of fingered by foreign men. This one, can't remember if it's Dutch or German, but again, very interesting. You can see the same thing at work. And then here, in this rather later one, pretty much the same. So you can see the pattern here, right, that's going on. Hugely popular school of art in the later 19th century, diverting the brutality of enslavement and seduction away from whites to non-Christians and non-European men whose alleged hunger for white women is made all too clear, it seems to me, in these works. These paintings share a great deal with what we might call harem art, most notable in the work of Ingres, the most famous of the so-called harem painters, and you can see classic examples here. And these are very interesting with these two because they come from very different moments, one from the 1820s and one right at the end of his life, about a year before he died, in which he recycles some of the first painting, as you can see, in quite interesting ways. But not just in art, but also in 18th century satirical cartoons. Thomas Rowlandson's memorable and cheeky cartoon was one of a sheaf of pornographic cartoons he composed between the 1790s and the 1810s, some of which, like this one with the priapic sultan, borderly rehearsed the common perception of what one of the most famous pornographic novels of the early 19th century would call the lustful Turk. And here I think is the lustful Turk really shown to you. So there he is, surveying his harem of women with his priapic member. This association of foreign and highly sexualized despotism and enslavement in the figure of the white slave had a long history. The term white slave would go through a number of different iterations over the 19th and 20th centuries, but prior to its associations with young women exploited in the factories in the industrial northeast of the US, and even later with the abduction of innocent young women to foreign brothels, it frequently focused on the harem, or I should say a fantasy version of the harem forged, as you can see, by rather lurid European ideas, and the avowedly insatiable desire of Eastern potentates for white female flesh. At a time when much of Europe regarded the Ottoman Empire as a threat, this was a way to suggest the predatory nature of this non-Christian and powerful empire not so very far from European shores. The Greek War of Independence, where Powers locates his slave figure, was part of this landscape, but Africa too was regarded as vulnerable to Ottoman expansion and tyranny. And when Africa was symbolized as a figure in chains, there was as great a likelihood that this represented Ottoman depredations as it did the rapacity of the Atlantic slave trade. These Orientalist pictures thus return us to Africa as the birthplace of slavery, but they also underscore that the Atlantic slave trade, so focused on the Caribbean and the United States, did not exhaust the discussion. I want in this vein to suggest yet another way to think about and indeed view slavery, one which is not specific to a geography, and one which insists on slavery's deep associations with a racialized colonialism. I want to propose a more capacious definition of slavery beyond the chains and leg irons, beyond the plantation and the factory, beyond the brothel and the so-called harem, not to erase those sites, but to offer a more capacious reading of slavery and its ties to imperialism. In the colonial context, especially, fear and fascination with the idea of enslavement to passion and to bad habits was never far below the surface. I thus move us to an unexpected but important geographical location, one we don't routinely associate with slavery, but where the tentacles of colonialism were strong and racial divides grew harder as white settlement burgeoned. When Europeans spoke confidently of dying races in Australia, and indeed elsewhere, one of the major factors they saw as driving this predicted extinction was that natives were enslaved, that was the word they often used, to drink, to tobacco, to unhealthy stimulants introduced by settlers and explorers. Their constitutions, so the argument went, could not withstand the effects of these newly introduced substances. More susceptible than white populations, the demon drink and other enticements enslaved men and women alike, weakening them both physically and morally. This was an argument which took its cue from evolutionary theory, with proponents speculating about the capacity of so-called lesser races to survive the allurements of modern life. It was a potent vision of a slavery of interiority, not defined by labor or even the slave collar or the loincloth, but by internal and thus inherent qualities. This image is from the French astrolabe's expedition to circumnavigate the globe under the command of Admiral Jules Dumont d'Urville in the late 1820s, and this picture is located in Australia. In this image, a clothed indigenous man in what we now call Australia is showing off the goods he's acquired from European visitors to an Aboriginal group. They are wearing either nothing or rudimentary skins of some kind, but his dandiest fashion has the status of a caricature. He doesn't wear clothing as it should be worn, and as do the European sailors who are standing behind him. His top hat and formal clothing seem preposterous and suggest that his natural condition is nakedness, that seemingly inevitable correlation of slavery. The image also implies at the same time his servitude to the cast-offs of European civilization, the baubles and trinkets he so proudly displays. But it wasn't only knickknacks and stimulants that could spell enslavement in allegedly primitive populations. And this comes back to full circle to my argument. The strong belief in the libidinism of tropical peoples fed the widespread notion that they were also enslaved by their passions, and in the classic Western binary, unable thus to exercise its desired obverse reason. The state of savagery, a key term in 19th century anthropology, was characterized by the triumph of passion over reason. And while evolutionary anthropology left the door open for development, plenty saw savagery in opposition to and incommensurable with civilization. The colonial record is full of grumbles by officials whose plans were frustrated by what they dubbed superstitious, uncooperative, ignorant, or ineducable natives, unappreciative of the benefits that awaited them under imperialism. Francis Galton, who enthusiastically embraced his distant cousin Darwin's evolutionary theory, nonetheless concluded on the journey he made to Africa in the early 1850s that many of the savage, his word, Africans he met were predestined for slavery. The Herero, he thought, and I quote, seemed to be made for slavery, while the Damara found what he called the weight of independence too heavy, preferring the unthinking ethos of slavery. These were arguments that naturalized slavery as the condition of particular groups. The white sex slave, for all the eroticism that surrounded her representation, was nonetheless pure and reluctant, victim to an enslaving passion that was not of her making and which was foreign to her nature and her implied cultural standing. So some groups are naturally enslavable, others are coerced into it and shouldn't be there. So by unyoking white slaves from broader notions of slavery, other varieties of enslavement could be understood racially, the link between savagery and slavery key then to explaining who was enslavable. For the white slave trade, rescue was possible, desirable, and necessary, and images of white slaves generally implied redemption and purity, as we've seen. Anti-slavery images likewise tempered the critique of degradation with hope by drawing on the theme of universal brotherhood in the parlance of the day as a counter to the idea of incommensurability. Thus, as per Galton, the African chooses slavery over the hard work of freedom, and thus savage and primitive peoples, unable to undertake the work of civilization and reason, must wither in the face of progress, incapable of assimilating, incommensurable with the modern world. The social death, as Orlando Patterson has so memorably phrased it, which was the lot of the African slave, was both a literal and a metaphorical stripping. Alongside their nakedness, slaves were also associated with an experienced loss of dignity, control, and humanity, as well as outright possession of their own bodies. An 1868 slave narrative, which, like that of Mary Prince, was the work of a woman who gained freedom, makes this clear. Elizabeth, Lizzie she was known as, Keckley, who became dressmaker to Lincoln's wife, relates, after she gained her freedom, relates how a cruel schoolmaster, at the bidding of her vengeful mistress, proposes to beat her. "I'm going to whip you," he commands, "so take down your dress this instant." Keckley then addresses her readers thus. "Recollect," she says, "I was 18 years of age, was a woman fully developed, and yet this man coolly bade me to take down my dress. I drew myself up proudly, firmly, and said, 'No, Mr. Bingham, I shall not take down my dress before you. Moreover, you shall not whip me unless you prove stronger.'" Needless to say, the encounter doesn't go well for Lizzie, who does get whipped. But the narrative is instructive. Like Mary Prince, Keckley uses the persistent trope of slave nakedness to intimate the degradation of the system. Like Prince, refusing nakedness in the presence of a white man with power over the slave body asserted personal dignity and spoke volumes about the problems of slavery. Much was at stake for Keckley and Prince, and indeed for slaves and other colonized peoples around the globe. Dismissed as naked, rough primitives, insisting on the accoutrements of European decency, as Prince and Keckley do, was a strategy to refocus where corruption and degradation lay. Their narratives were part of an abolitionist tradition, though Keckley's was published after the end of slavery, in which American abolitionists in particular often drew comparisons between tyrannical slave owners and Eastern despots, whose alleged possession of large enclaves of nubile women fired the imagination, as we've seen, of artists, poets, and pornographers. Drawing on such comparisons rendered slavers, rather than their slaves, as beyond the bounds of Christianity, infidels by any other name. The slave tales with which I've begun, and you'll be relieved to hear I'm now ending, were the work of women who understood only too well the myriad forms of sexual violence built into slavery. Their narratives closely link racialized and sexualized bodies with beatings. And although these are also tales of resistance, they speak of the unbridled power at the heart of all forms of slavery. It's the reason why anti-slavery propaganda put torture and punishment at the center of its visual field. Carol Lasser has dubbed this phenomenon of voyeuristic abolitionism, and the works discussed here mostly reflect this disturbing and eroticized romance with violence. This fascination with the raced, sexed, and downtrodden body is powerfully expressed by the nakedness so common in these images, and also suggests why the bulk of them depicted female rather than male slaves. It also speaks to why white male slaves were so rarely on show, but that's a story for another day and will be in this chapter. At the height of European colonialism and in a time of vigorous debate around slavery, these images reek of colonial violence. The association between race, slavery, and nakedness they make manifest was part of what we might dub the portfolio of colonialist art, an art which extended the colonial hold into aesthetics, drawing on the well-trodden idea of the naked savage, even when, as was increasingly the case, these images fueled abolitionist sentiment. The limits of sympathy, the pull to sexualize the body, the deep association that saw nakedness as a sign of the primitive are all on display in the works I've shown you here. Works which performed colonialism quite as convincingly as the elaborate ceremonies that cloaked empire in pomp and circumstance, or the labyrinthine governance that futilely helped to hold it together. But where the offices and structures of colonialism could not, in the end, hold fast and did disappear, the art it stimulated continues to remind us of just what was at stake in colonial rule and on whose bodies that history could be and was written. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Levine, that was just so rich and provocative. Assuming it's generated some thoughts and questions, we take up a little bit of time. Questions. If you do have a question, please do tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Adam Rothman. I teach history here at Georgetown. I have two questions, totally unrelated. One is, could you talk a little bit about abolitionist readings of Hiram Power's Greek Slave? And the second question is, what reading the sculptural representations of slavery from the 18th and 19th centuries or 19th centuries, what lessons do these sculptures have for contemporary memorializations of the history of slavery at places like Georgetown?
Yes, it's quite a big topic here at the moment, isn't it? Powers and the abolitionist movement. It's a complicated question because powers in the 1840s, when we see the first version, isn't really outspoken as an abolitionist, and indeed at that point is rather alarmed by the abolitionist movement, which he thinks is too radical. He doesn't really want to have anything to do with it. And it's only over the course of the kind of reiterations of the statue that he becomes more and more pro-abolitionist. And I believe it's is it the Kansas-Nebraska? I'm not an Americanist. Kansas-Nebraska Act, is that? Have I got that right? The one where they're going to extend they're going to expand the where slavery could be in the 1850s. You know the act I mean, right? That. So it's only when that act is being considered that he becomes a kind of open abolitionist, writes to people saying, okay, now I get it. Now I understand what abolitionism is about. I think that abolitionists understood the piece. They understood that the piece could speak to contemporary American problems at the time, but that's not how the piece was marketed. And I think that my sense is the abolitionist voice was actually muted in the 1840s when it first went on display. I mean, after all, this goes to cities like New Orleans and other parts of the South, and it's as popular in those areas as it is in the North. So I think there's a real avoidance and a real kind of muting of the abolitionist voice in terms of powers at that moment. He's read as an abolitionist in Britain, where the statue, as I said, was enormously popular, but I haven't looked at abolitionist papers per se, but I'm not aware of a big abolitionist debate around the statue. If I'm wrong, and there is one, I would love to hear about it. In terms of contemporary memorializations, yeah. It's interesting. If you look at some of the memorialization, there's been a lot of fuss about, a lot of controversy, and I'm going to write about this in the chapter as well, about some of the modern memorializations in other countries around the abolition of slavery, and particularly in Jamaica. There's a sculptress called Laura Facey who produced a big sculpture that is supposed to memorialize the end of colonial rule there, and has come under enormous amounts of fire locally. And it's very interesting, the reasons why. It has to do, again, with the sexuality of the black body. people argued that it's a male and a female, black male and a female figure, Jamaicans standing, looking at one another, across from one another, and they're naked. And some of the complaints have been that it's inappropriate for a public place, but a lot of the debates have also been around the size of the male's genitalia, that they're too big, and that they attract too much attention, and thus, in a sense, take away from the other kinds of messages, the celebratory messages that should be the case. So even today, I think that these questions around nakedness as an emblem of slavery continue to have incredible resonance. I mean, my argument in the book is that we still have enormous problems. Even as we strip the body all the time, we still have incredible problems with that. So I think in terms of thinking about contemporary memorialization, it does well to look at, it's a good idea to look at some of the more contemporary fusses that have gone on, and I think Jamaica is probably the most instructive of those. Faces I think it's called Redemption Song, the sculptor. And if I were Georgetown, I'd take a look at that, and I would take a look at the arguments around that and the controversy around that statue, if they're going to think about the ways in which to do this. And one would hope, I think, my hope would be, as somebody who spent a lot of time thinking about these, that using the kind of the most obvious figurations, the chain, the loincloth, the manacles, at this point has become such a hackneyed and such an offensive way of doing this, that there have to be more interesting and more innovative and more respectful ways of thinking about how you make sure that we don't forget that slavery was central to the foundation of this institution, or not the foundation, but the enrichment of this institution, for example. So I think those are the ways that I would urge the folks who might be thinking about how to do that to do this. But I think the avoidance of some of the more typical and, by this stage, stereotyped and offensive figures might be a very good idea. And Facey, I think, really encountered that in Jamaica in unfortunate ways.
Hi, thanks for doing this today. Sorry I came in late. But I'm Sarah, and I am in the Department of History at Georgetown. And I guess I had a question that a little bit follows up on the comment you made in response to Professor Rothman's on nakedness taking away from other messages and the situation surrounding that. And earlier, you mentioned when you showed the cartoon of the Ottoman and the slew of white women, you said it was also a time in Europe when Europe saw the Ottomans as a threat. Do you feel like that argument plays into the proliferation of such kind of pieces, that these other concerns within the structure of colonialism and the processes of empire, using this eroticism and depictions of such encounters took away from the conversation of state building and empire? I just want to know if you can draw that argument out more, if you feel it's necessary to draw that argument out more or not. Or if you feel that we should be having instead more conversations about the depictions themselves. That, when you're talking about the sculpture from Jamaica, for example, that should we, in talking about the man's genitalia, we're having this large conversation about that. Are we ignoring conversations about other things going on?
No, we're not. I think that, we can go back to the late 18th century and think about things like the fiction of Marianne, right, as the kind of symbol of liberté. Oh, sorry, liberté, égalité, fraternité. That's great. I mean, what's interesting there is that it's a single-breasted woman, right? It's a woman with one breast revealed who becomes that symbol. And if you look at things like maps and the other kind of paraphernalia that signal the development of different kinds of states, it's remarkable how often the female body actually figures in those. So I think that actually it's part of state building rather than a diversion from. I mean, it can be a diversion from, obviously, but I don't think it has to be a diversion from. And I think there are many, many instances where, in fact, if anything, this is precisely how ideas around the nation, the nation in a kind of colonial context do in fact get formed. And the French Revolution is just one example, but I think there are many others. And I think, again, the Facey sculpture is a very good example of that. So no, I don't think it's a detraction. I don't think we can separate those things out. I think they fundamentally belong together. I mean, this is a period of major state building, which I think is what you're driving at, right? But the nation, the way that European nations are figuring themselves in this period is very much in a colonial context, right? And they are looking over their shoulder at the Ottoman Empire in the early 19th century. I mean, Rowlandson's cartoons make that clear, as does a slew, not just of visual stuff, but, literature as well, that the Ottomans are a huge threat in this period. They become, and right through the 19th century, they are a threat in many different ways. And one of the things we tend to forget about the British Empire in particular is that it has the largest Muslim population of anywhere in the world in the 19th century. This is of significance, and it's something that I think has been played down in histories of the empire in ways that are quite worrying, and I'm not sure exactly know why that's been, but I think that's changing now, and I think whoops, as I drop everything. I think all of these kinds of things do play into that. So no, I think state building is hugely important here. This is a sliver of a chapter and of a very large book that does that stuff, but I'm not trying to ignore it by any means, and I don't think it's a detraction. I think these things belong together. I think these kinds of visual images, the kinds of texts that do this, displace all sorts of anxieties about the instabilities of colonial rule, about the depredations that come out of these kinds of things somewhere else. One of the things that, as I said, I couldn't do here, but I got very interested in, and I'm just going to write this piece next week, is about the depictions of white male slaves. If I'm right, and I think I'm right, but I'm still working on that bit, if I'm right, those images exist until, but not beyond, the middle of the 18th century, and then they disappear. And I think that's a really interesting moment for them to be disappearing, because I think it says something about the nature of states and colonial rule. There's quite a lot of early modern images of white slaves, of Christian slaves, in the work of illustrators and the kind of thing that Linda Coll is talking about in Captives, but I'm not finding it for the later period. That tells me that what you're driving at is clearly really important. You can't have the symbol of a white enslaved Christian male in a period in which the kind of nation building that's going on in that period is happening. I don't think those two are commensurate. Does that make sense?
My name is Dorota Glowacka. I am a Holocaust scholar from Canada. So just apropos, I see a lot of parallels with what you are saying and the kind of imagery of nude female bodies in Holocaust commemoration that are sexualized, but it's always about commemoration and compassion. So it's fascinating. Thank you for this. But I have a different question, and it is about, it relates to your quotation from Lizzie narrative. And so I'd be interested whether there are, and I'm sure there are, visual depictions at the same time by enslaved or formerly enslaved persons, and whether, if there are such visual images, again, of nude male and female bodies, whether there is a trace of perhaps these images of female passivity, sexualizations may have been internalized by enslaved people themselves, or whether they are, counter-hegemonic. I'm kind of using bell hooks' terminology here, and whether they provide a reflection on the status of women as these sexualized objects and chattel, etc. So is there, I'm sure there is a discourse like that, and I'm more familiar with contemporary depictions like Kara Walker, for instance.
Absolutely.
But I'm not aware very much of the discourse, visual kind of pictorial discourse at the same time.
Right. There is a female African-American sculptress, I'm going to get the name wrong, I don't know how it's pronounced, Eumonia Williams, I think is the last name, and I haven't written that bit yet, but there are very, very few. There are two, her and a woman called Harriet Hemon, something like that. You can see that bit's really not written. It's right here on the periphery of my vision because it's about a week away. So there are a couple of black women sculptresses working in Italy. Interestingly enough, in the 19th century, Italy was where you went if you were a sculptor to get your training and to prove your seriousness and your challenge and the rest of it. And they are doing depictions of slaves. I haven't looked at the work very, very carefully yet, but it does seem to me to have the kind of dignity in it that we see in these slave narratives. At this point, they're the only ones I know of. And of course, they were women who were free blacks, obviously, if they're working in Italy in the late 19th century. Yes, they're not enslaved women. They're from wealthier, more educated backgrounds. At this juncture, I know the literary texts by slaves better than I know the visual texts, and those are the only two that I know about at this point. There may be others, but if there are, I haven't yet discovered them. And again, if anyone knows of other visual artists at work in that period who come from a background of slavery, I'd love to know about them, but they're the only two that I've discovered, and I haven't worked on them enough to say anything terribly definitive or interesting at this period, but it's in the very, very near future for me to do that. In terms of contemporary artists, there's a slew of fabulous work, Kara Walker, Rosini Kempadu, Bernie Searle, just a whole bunch of people doing very, very interesting work, both male and female, coming out of Britain, coming out of South Africa, coming out of the United States and Canada. And it really is an incredibly rich work, which often takes the kinds of images that I've shown you here and reworks them in ways that attempt, and I think very successfully, to subvert them. I particularly recommend Rosini Kempadu's Of Sweetness and Light series, which is a tremendous set of, she's a black British photographer, artist, and she did this series it's sometimes called Of Sweetness and Light and sometimes called The Big House, but it's about plantation, it's about the plantation, and she weaves together sort of shadowy, haunting figures of slaves with pictures of the plantation buildings. They're really arresting. And Kara Walker's stuff, especially the sugar, I think it's called Sugar Mama. She did this giant sculpture made of sugar. Sugar, of course, being a major slave product. And it's this big sort of mammy figure. It's absolutely extra. It doesn't exist anymore except in photographs, because being made of sugar, has a fairly short shelf life as a sculpture, but it's a really remarkable piece in white sugar. So there's a whole series of kind of ways in which she's playing with that. So, as I said, the only ones I know about are these two sculptresses. I don't know of any painters or cartoonists or anything like that from this period. So that's why I'm using the textual narratives right now, because it's what I have in terms of a slave voice.
If I can just, because it would be also interesting to see how female bodies are figured in visual art by male black artists.
Yes.
At the time, considering the dynamic of gender and like black maleness and feminization of black bodies, etc. I
don't know is the short answer, and I wish I did know, and I'm going to look for them, but I haven't come across any. I haven't come across any yet, but that doesn't mean they're not out there. It just means that my reach hasn't got there yet. It'll be very interesting to see if that exists. I think you're absolutely right, and it'll be absolutely fascinating, but don't have that yet. But thank you. Great idea.
Thank you so much. This was remarkable to me, and I'm speaking as a journalist. I teach journalism at Georgetown, and I'm in a prior life, I made the Civil War series with Ken Burns.
Oh, right.
And that is now almost 30 years ago that I started it. And I'm from Washington, and I'm kind of revisiting some of the absence of visual depictions of enslaved people in in journalism, in popular culture, in visual culture, not at the high art end. And especially given how dense this city was for a slave trade, not for actual enslavement, because there's not big industry here, but as a crossroads of slave trade, it has struck me massively that there's, and I don't have a question, but I'm trying to sort through what this topic is, that it's a missing history. It's visually America has sort of, in my studies and my research of this, the iconography of this is only done by abolitionists as sort of lithographs and for propaganda, which generally wasn't naked people. It was domestic.
Absolutely
right?
wasn't naked people.
Much
Yep.
more proper. And then images of people, reward wanted. So already people are being associated with being outlaws. But I'm sort of struck by how, after doing a film on this and looking at everything visual possible, how absent the visual depiction is, except in this sort of high art way. And I don't really know where to go with that, except that this country, and certainly this city, decided not to see what was happening every day. And if you go over to Alexandria, which was the largest slave depot trading place, a major thoroughfare, Duke Street, people were in chains being marched down to the docks as a daily sight for 30 years, an absolute ordinary, like going to CVS. And in some way that I've never seen a depiction of that, but it was an ongoing activity in this city and broad daylight. And then a very few pictures of people being marched past the Capitol, where there was a very large slave depot. And I'm curious that maybe that no one wants to depict something that's already so barbaric in mass culture and in public ways. But I'm struck, having missed how absent it was pre-photography, but still, there's. To me, there's just a glaring absence in how you tell a story when historically we decided not to see that story, or not to replicate it, depict it in very, very minimal ways, unless they're abolitionist, and that's mostly 1830s, 1840s. It doesn't, as you get close to the 1860s, they're not showing that. And it's not the high art, but it's striking. And the other note I have is, when you talk about these sales of replicas of these bronzes and marbles, the immediate iconography to me is Abu Ghraib, is people shackled and chained, not something you'd ever want to purchase, to look at. And even that is like such a distancing. I'm so struck by the idea that could be made something that somebody would want a living room.
Highly profitable. I mean, they sold thousands of these. Yeah, thousands. But I mean, what you're saying is absolutely right, and I think Hiram Powers' Greek Slave in some ways is a really good example of what you're talking about, because it's a slave, she's in chains, she's clearly a slave, but it displaces conversation about contemporary US slavery onto something else, right? So you make it about the Greeks and the Turks. You make it about a Christian woman. You make it about a kind of slavery that is unnatural, because slavery doesn't belong to white people, right? Slavery belongs to black people. That is who black people are, right? And so you displace the conversation. And what fascinates me about the Powers piece is that it's happened, it's 1843 when he casts it, I think. And it doesn't become, as far as I can tell, a major conversation piece about American slavery. Had it been black, it wouldn't have got the attention that it would have got. I'm arguing it wouldn't have got the attention, and it wouldn't have become popular. So, Bell can do it in Britain as in a specifically abolitionist register, but that wouldn't, I'm arguing, be possible in 1840s America. So you can do slavery, but you displace it onto something else. You displace it onto the nasty Ottomans, right? You displace it onto poor old Christian Greece. It's about to get beaten up by those horrid, Muslim Turks, right? That's what you do. And yet, abolitionists knew, but you couldn't speak it, right?
Just following off of the idea of sort of
the absence. A figure that seems to be implied but absent is that of the rescuer. So you have the only one I could think of that came close was your Lincoln sculpture. But you have figures who have managed to escape or broken their own chains. And I couldn't help but think of other Victorian paintings of women being rescued, which inevitably is a knight.
Yes, that's right.
With a
Pre-Raphaelite.
pre-Raphaelite.
They're keen on
imagery.
that one, yeah.
Exactly. And I was just wondering if had you come across images of what a person who may rescue the bound woman may look like, or whether it is just one of those absences which it's implied that it's the viewer of the images, or it's just
Really
beyond
interesting question.
representation.
Yeah. Gosh, that is really interesting. I have not. I mean, and obviously, this may simply be my ignorance, but I haven't come across any. I can't think of a single depiction in any medium off the top of my head where the presence of a rescuer is part of the picture. That is, I'm going to have to go. I mean, no, I haven't. I literally haven't come across. I can't. No,
either.
You can't either. Okay, that makes me feel better. That's really interesting. And especially, as you say, since, the PRB, especially the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, love that stuff, right? Millets, knight errant, there's always a knight coming along, picking up the nice, incredibly white lady. I mean, they can't get whiter than the PRB ladies. They're really very, very, very white ladies. They're almost transparent. But no, in this genre, I have never seen a rescuer. No. I suppose because if you had a rescuer, it would... What would that do to the erotic charge, right? If she's not about to be deflowered by the priapic man, then there is no erotic charge, right? It's sort of at the brink, and I wonder whether what it's performing is that kind of at the brink. That's really interesting, but no, not come across any of those. I'm going to keep a really sharp lookout now. But I think it would change the politics quite distinctively. Yeah.
Maybe a couple questions, and then we may.
Yes, thank you. My name is Laishan. I worked in Africa for the United Peacekeeping for some years.
Yeah.
So that's the particular reason
Yeah.
I came here. I was very much struck, actually, by how much work has been done in this area. Not only the sculptures, etc., which has always been done and kept throughout the history. And I guess all the images, the depiction of whatever has happened is meant for us to remember the history. And then, so my first question would be, throughout your studies or in your presentations, what's the feedback from the Black population? And the second question would be related to the first one, is that through in the last 10 years, I've been working in Africa. The impression would be we talked about the change of the politics, but then I'm worrying about the change of the mindset, in the sense that population on that continent are still waiting for rescue, rather than you see the courage and then the momentum to strive for their own independence. Because we talk about, from all these images, we talked about the lack of dignity and humanity, the lack of freedom, independence, and etc. And people have all been struggling for that. But then I do witness, less so in contemporary times, that they are pointing fingers at the old colonialism brought us all these troubles and etc. And then they're laying back, waiting for assistance and things. So how do you look at the momentum of their own drive to move forward? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, to speak your second question first, I think the terms that sprung to my mind when you were talking were neocolonialism and globalization. That is to say that I think the system in place makes it very difficult for many formerly colonized peoples to occupy a position that isn't dependent in those kinds of ways, right? And I mean, there's been a lot of work done on neocolonial dependence, right, by economists, by development people, by all sorts of people. And so I think in terms of the contemporary moment, we, in a sense, have a system in which colonialism has been dismantled only in its most official structures, and still, there really is, I think, a kind of neocolonialism that is tremendously troubling, and continues to divide the world in ways that divide up the riches inequitably, and mean that there are countries in which children are dying who don't need to die, and so forth and so on. So I think that's a kind of political economy question, and a very important one. And my argument would be that colonialism never really died, except in its most official of terms. In terms of thinking, I loved your first question about the response, the way that this was received by African American communities. I'm going to hedge my bets here because I can't remember whether it's the John Quincy Adams Ward statue or the Thomas Ball, but one of those two, was actually paid for by black subscription. Black Americans wanted a memorialization of the end of slavery after the 1862 Emancipation Proclamation, and they actually themselves, or people, I think it was blacks in Washington, but I'm not quite sure where. I think it was Washington blacks. You may know this from your. It was national. Okay. It's the Ball one. Okay, I knew it was one of the two, right? And they actually raised subscriptions from African Americans in order to build that. I mean, I think there was some concern ultimately about what the statue did show, and there was a competition which Ball won, right, to do so. But it was a black-funded sculpture, which is really quite interesting. And I don't know that it's unique, but it's certainly unusual, particularly in this period. So that's sort of the beginning, I think, of those kinds of questions.
Thank you, and thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask, at the end you had a comment about depictions of nakedness, but also sort of comical dress as marking out certain populations as enslavable.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that was gendered, particularly because you were talking about the sort of erotic charge and the particular kind of sexual violence around these naked women, and did that then sort of raise in some ways to become a critique of the enslavability of women in particular, or have you found that at all in the visual language?
That's a terrific question. I haven't thought about this enough, again, to be authoritative, but off the top of my head, in terms of the kinds of images that I've collected, they're slightly different depending on whether the depiction is of men or of women. So the tendency is to depict men either foppishly dressed, as in this one, wrongly but foppishly dressed, right? Sort of, wearing a top hat and tailcoat in an inappropriate way or something like that, or putting the sleeves of a jacket on the legs like trousers, those kinds of things. You see a lot of that kind of stuff. And in literary texts as well as visual images, you get kind of colonists poking fun at them for doing that. But when it comes to improperly dressed women wearing inappropriate dress, what you get, particularly actually in the late 18th century, in the Caribbean, is these quite elaborate pictures. And Diane Criss has written Criss has written quite a lot about this. You get these pictures of elegantly but overdressed Creole women. So women who are racially ambiguous in some kind of way, right? Or maybe are free blacks, and they're dressed to the nines. They're going to the market to buy oranges, and they're dressed to the nines. And so it's a slightly different kind of a critique, and one that allows a kind of sexualization, right? Because they're just like peacocks and all of those kinds of things. So I think that the ways in which male and female bodies are wrongly dressed has a tendency to be different, such as the men look pathetic and the women look sexual. Now, obviously, there's no rule about that. I'm sure I could find exceptions to that. But that thinking about the material that I have, and I've got thousands of images, about 1,000 on my actual formal database. That's what, off the top of my head, I would say it's looking like right now. So slightly different, but there's a critique of both. But they allow for that continued and consistent and tenacious and persistent sexualization of the black female body, I think.
Just to add a comment to that, that's really interesting. As you were speaking, I was thinking about this debate that's swirling right now, contemporaneously, on Malala Yousafzai, the Pakistani education activist who just started at Oxford.
Right.
Really on this enslavement of women through their dress and on them being inappropriately dressed. There's like a big furor in Pakistan where I do a lot of work personally and professionally, that she went to Oxford wearing skinny jeans and like a Western style shirt instead of a dupatta and a shalwar kameez. And the Pakistani press is writing about her as being enslaved to the West.
Isn't
she
that
has
interesting?
given in, she is a slave to the West, she is only promoting Western values, she has left her Pakistani modesty completely behind.
Right.
It's very
So again, that
interesting.
use of enslavement,
Yeah,
right,
they're
to talk
specifically
about
using that
something,
word.
right? It's such an interesting concept when you turn it away from the fetters, the literal metal fetters, to thinking about those kinds of enslavements, right? And this is the East writing back, right? Because this is exactly what I was arguing the West is doing about the enslavement of these folks to different kinds of things. And here now, one of the critiques you get, right, from the East is, they've lost it to these degraded Western values. It's a really interesting inversion of these kinds of things. It's such a fantastic example. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor.
Well, perhaps on that, wonderful final comment.
Perhaps we can all wrap it up, and please join me in thanking Professor Levine for a wonderful morning.
And I'd like to thank all of you because the questions have really been incredibly useful as I'm working on this chapter right now, and this gives me so much to think about, and it's going to enrich the chapter so much. So many, many thanks for such a fantastically engaged bunch of questions. I'm really grateful.